Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zapazzi, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history and the authors that have written about them. Today's program is with author Don Lasseter and his book, Die For Me, the terrifying true story of the Charles Ng, Leonard Lake Torture Murders. Inspired by a fictional book called The Collector, ex-Marines Leonard Lake and Charles Ng abducted, tortured, and murdered women in a secret homemade dungeon, all the while videotaping their ghastly deeds. They took the lives of at least 16 victims and are among the most notorious serial killer teams in true crime history. Die For Me, the terrifying true story of the Charles Ng, Leonard Lake Torture Murders, by Don Lasseter. My guest, Don Lasseter, is now working on his 19th and 20th books. One was about World War II, one about the Kennedy assassination, and one called The Patricia Cornwell Companion. All the rest have been true crime. His first book was published in 1995. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, Don Lasseter.
Thank you for inviting me, Dan. I've been looking forward to talking about Charles Ng.
Yes, very much. This is quite the story, an incredible story. Now, the first question I have to ask you, you've written about many other cases. What specifically made you decide to write about this one?
As a general rule, Dan, I prefer not to deal with high-profile cases like this one. I'd much rather select a small, relatively unknown case which has some interesting twist in its plot, and it doesn't have high publicity. But in this case, my publisher gave me a buzz and asked me if I would drop over to the trial, which happened to be a change of venue from Northern California to Orange County, where I live. So that was pretty convenient. I agreed. I went over and sat in the trial for a couple of days and was hooked. Obviously, this was going to be a very, very important true crime story.
Now, a British author named John Fowles had written a popular fictional book called The Collector in 1963. It ends up being quite significant to this story. Before we get to the significance, what is the book about, and from whose perspective is the story primarily told?
The Collector by John Fowles is about a young man, Frederick Clegg, who is a butterfly collector, and he falls for a very pretty young woman named Miranda. But he realizes that he's just not in her class, and he just has a lot of fantasies about her. Clegg comes into a good sudden fortune, and which allows him to buy a house out in the country, and he gets this brilliant idea to just capture Miranda like he does his butterflies and hold her there until she falls in love with him. The first third of the book is told from his point of view. The second third is from her point of view. And then finally, the last part is his point of view again. He holds her. She does not fall in love with him. He does not have sexual fantasies about her, unlike what we see in the Charles Ng, Leonard Lake case.
Well, let me cut you off right there so we can unfold this story here, because it is a very complex story as well. So we've got to get everybody to get the facts straight here. Now, in the book The Collector, the imprisoned woman, Miranda, tries many ways to either escape or persuade her abductor to let her go. Does the Collector ever mention that he might let the woman go?
I think in the book he hints at it sometimes, but I think he has no intention to let her go ever. Eventually, she comes to know that she's not in real danger, but she unfortunately dies anyway while under his control, perhaps from pneumonia. We don't know.
Okay, now Leonard Lake is one of the killers featured in Die For Me. And what was Leonard Lake like? What was his background? And finally, he was discharged from the Marine Corps because of medical reasons. And in the end, can you tell us what that medical reason was? So give us the background on Leonard Lake. What was he really like, and what was some of his background?
Well, Leonard Lake was born, to an ex-Navy man and a young woman in San Francisco. The parents soon split up when the woman decided to try to pursue her husband, ex-husband. She went to a train station with her two babies. She had asked Leonard, who was only 6 at the time, if he'd like to go with her, and he'd said no. But at the train station, he decided he wanted to go and just had a big fit right there on the platform, but he had to stay home with his grandparents. Psychiatrists later suggested that that was the beginning of Leonard Lake's hatred for women. He grew up and he never lived with his parents again, lived with his grandparents, grew up in San Francisco, went to high school, had some peculiar characteristics. One of his cousins later reported that Leonard had a huge collection of mice, and when he got tired of them, he gave some away and killed the rest of them, and the cousin watched Leonard dissolve them in acid. That sort of gave a hint of what kind of a peculiar man he was going to be.
Yes, certainly. Now, continuing with his peculiar behavior, maybe you could just continue with his background and also leading up to his stint in the Marines.
Correct. He went through high school and then soon after high school, joined the Marines and went to Vietnam. There's some controversies whether he actually saw combat or not. He claimed he did. Later, I think he confessed to one woman that he spent most of the time in a very safe place. But he came back all disillusioned, as many real Vietnam veterans did, and decided he wanted to be a survivalist, preparing for a future Holocaust in which the world would be destroyed. And he decided he would have a bunker equipped with all kinds of supplies so he could survive, and he would like to have a woman in there too. Eventually, he decided that that woman would be his sex slave, and that became a fantasy for him, stemming from his having read The Collector when he was a teenager. But he perverted it somewhat. Fowles' character, protagonist, just wanted the woman to fall in love. Leonard admitted that he wanted the woman just to be a sex object.
Now, when we talk about the Leonard Lake doing a stint in Vietnam and Marines, he was discharged for medical reasons, like I had mentioned. What was that medical reason?
Let's see, I think it was called impending psychosis or something of that nature. He apparently had some very serious mental problems.
Didn't the psychiatrist say that he was a harm to himself or to others? Was that the conclusion they made at the end?
That's correct. He probably would be a harm to others.
Okay, now Charles Ng is the other killer featured in Die For Me. What was his background, and what type of character was Charles Ng?
Charles Ng was born in Hong Kong to a middle-class family. His father had survived the war and worked his way up to become a camera salesman for a major company, had 3 children, and determined absolutely that his kids were going to have a great education. They lived in a high-rise apartment, very crowded, with several relatives living with them. But Charles didn't seem to go along with the idea that education was that important. So his father sometimes had to give him a pretty good spanking. He was later accused of beating him severely, but it didn't seem to change the young man. Eventually, they sent young Charles Ng to England to live with a relative. That didn't work out, and then by the time he was in high school age, they sent him to San Francisco to live with an aunt. He did that for a while, but as soon as he turned 18, he joined the Marines. It's interesting how he got in the Marines because he's not a U.S. citizen. Somehow it was suggested that documents were forged to allow him to get in there.
Okay, I see. Now, how did Charles Ng and Leonard Lake eventually meet? You say they were both in the Marines. How did they meet and where?
Well, Charlie decided while he was in Kaneohe Bay in Hawaii that it would be a good idea to steal some weapons from the armory and sell them for profit. He did, and he was caught, and he was facing a court-martial, but he escaped and made his way to San Francisco. While he was in Hawaii, though, he had met with a few other fellows who wanted to be survivalists, and one of them mentioned that he knew a fellow in California named Leonard Lake who was a survivalist. So when Charlie came to San Francisco, he joined the Marines. He stole the weapons. He was going to be court-martialed. He escaped, and he comes back, and he links up with Leonard Lake in a little town called Philo in Northern California.
Now, we spoke of the book, and getting back to the book, The Collector, the fictional tale of a man who is a butterfly collector who fantasizes about collecting a woman, instead one day acts upon his urges. Now, this book was Leonard Lake's favorite. And why was it his favorite? And what was it about the collector that interested him so much?
Well, he read it as a teenager, and I think he began to this idea of having a woman as a captive, as and having complete control over a woman. But his was a perverse view. The protagonist in Fowles' book just wanted to be loved. Leonard wanted a sex slave.
Now, there's another central character to this story, and her name is Clara Lynn Ballas, or Cricket, her nickname. And you describe as the girlfriend, ex-wife / girlfriend of Leonard Lake. Who was she? When did they meet? And how close were they? How well did Cricket really know Leonard Lake?
While Leonard was moving around from town to town after getting out of the Marines, he was a pseudo-photographer. He lured young women for various methods to lure them into posing. He usually tried to get them to pose nude for him. He found at one point in Northern California a man who owned a goat that had been its horn transformed to a single horn to make it look like a unicorn. Leonard saw that as a great attraction to young girls. He took it to the Renaissance Pleasure Fair in Marin County, north of San Francisco. And while he was there demonstrating the goat and trying to lure young women to pose, this young woman came by, Clara Lynn Ballas, Cricket, and they really hit it off together. She was equal to him in his weird sense of humor, his jokes, and his interest in sex. And they became lovers and eventually married and eventually divorced. But they continued their relationship together for the rest of his life.
Now, you say that they shared a mutual interest in sex. How important was sex to Leonard Lake, and what were some of the features of the sexual desires even early on, before his bunker was realized and was constructed? What were some of the features of his sex life that may or may not be a precursor to some of the events that happened later? What was his interest like, and what were some of the features of that sex life?
Well, actually, she went along with the idea of capturing a woman and using him in a menage a trois, forcing a woman to be a menage a trois with him. But they didn't have to force it. In some cases, they met young women who were very willing to perform with them. They were both highly experimental in sexuality. They at one point made a tape of themselves, and that was shown in the trial later to show that Cricket Ballas was probably culpable in the murders that happened later.
Okay, the Leonard Lake relocated and put his sex slave plan into action. Whose property was it where he did this construction of this bunker, and whose property was this? And give us a little bit of background on the construction of the bunker itself and how his plan to have a sex slave came to fruition. What was the turn of events that led Leonard Lake to be able to begin achieving his long time fantasy?
Well, let's back up a little ways. At Philo, where he met Charles Ng, where Charles Ng connected with him, he and his wife Cricket were living in Philo, operating a little motel. Charlie shows up, and the three of them are living together. But because Charlie had stolen those weapons and was a fugitive from the Marines, Leonard also had stolen some weapons and burglaries. The FBI got wind of it and raided the place, captured Charlie, and sent him for a trial, and he eventually wound up in Leavenworth. Lake was also captured but went to jail, and his wife put up the bail, and he became a fugitive from then on, operating under various fake names. And he moved around to various places in California on the run. He started building that bunker in 3 different sites, but it just didn't work out. Eventually, he moved to a little hamlet in the Gold Country in Calaveras County in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada into a house owned by Cricket's father. And it's very rural, way at the end of a long, narrow driveway, and he decided that was going to be the final site. And he went to work, and it took him 6 months to finally build that concrete block bunker, and with a secret room inside it, covered by a hidden shelves that actually concealed a door, and it was a cell for his sex slaves. So on that property in Wilseyville, he actually, his fantasy came to fruition to have a bunker. And then when Charlie got out of Leavenworth Prison, he rejoined Lake, and that's when the murders began.
Okay, now, Leonard Lake had kept a written diary for many years outlining his ghoulish fantasies. While all the necessary construction was being done on the property in preparation for the secret dungeon, Leonard Lake, in preparation for the secret dungeon, recorded a video diary outlining the progress of the construction, but also stating his philosophy in life. And I quote, "This tape, which you are hearing now, is going to be the lead-in of the various phases of construction of a building which, hopefully, will be the first of a series of underground buildings. The main emphasis of the building, the whole justification for its expense and its effort, will be a hidden portion, a secret room, if we can call it that will house a cell, a jail cell, if you will. The purpose of that cell will be the imprisonment of a young lady who probably, at this moment, is unknown to me. Whether I can do this or not will remain to be seen. Obviously, I've never done such a thing before, and it may not work. However, I want to try. I want to try. Life as I am living, it is boring. The challenge of this project, the excitement, the thrill of it will be an exciting experience even if it fails. As long as I don't get caught, it's very attractive. It's something that I fantasize daily about. We'll see. I don't think there's much more to say on the subject. This hopefully will be a mystery. I can hardly wait." Now, what was Leonard Lake's basic philosophy regarding women, which he included in the same incredible video diary?
Just very simple, Dan, that women should be used at his whim when he wanted them, and should be put back on a shelf or in that little secret cell when he didn't want them. And he had absolutely no value on their lives at all. To him, they were nothing but something to be used. That tape you've just described, he made himself. He sat up on a tripod and sat in a brown chair in the Wilseyville property and taped that in February of 1983. It was later called the Lake Philosophy tape.
Incredible. Now, you say that construction took about 6 months, and after that, Charles Ng reunited with Leonard Lake. How long is it before they begin to abduct someone, and how long till they kill? And who is their first victim?
Actually, Charlie joined him before the construction was finished, because there are photographs of Charlie Ng helping build that bunker.
Right.
And it was sometime, not very long after it was finished, but we need to back up again, because Lake's first victim, murder victim, incredibly, was probably his own younger brother. In December 1982, Donald Lake, who was somewhat, I don't know, it's an old-fashioned term, retarded. He had some mental disabilities. And Lake, his whole life, was very denigrating toward his younger brother, who was 6 years younger, and criticized him for collecting Social Security disability payments, saying that he was just a maggot on society. He didn't deserve to live. But one time he shows up in San Francisco, where his brother was living with his relatives, and said, "Oh, I have a great job for Donald up north. He's going to go with me." He left with Lake and was never seen again. But Lake suddenly showed up in various places around the state using the name Donald Lake and collecting the Social Security disability check. That was probably his first murder victim, was his own younger brother. His second murder victim was probably the best man at his wedding, a man named Charles Gunnar, a very heavy-set fellow who had known Lake for many years and had been a friend. But Gunnar was also collecting disability payments. He disappeared in May 1983, and Lake was suddenly using his name everywhere he went. So those murders preceded anything Charles Ng was involved in. Also, while Lake was living in Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, selling drugs for a living, several other people, a young man named Randy Jacobson, a musician named Maurice Rock, and a young woman named Cheryl O'Carroll, all vanished. Their remains were later found up in the just pieces of their bones were found up in the Wilseyville property. So the first victim that Charles Ng was involved was a family of three: Harvey Dubbs, his wife, and their little infant son, who lived in San Francisco and owned some very exotic, I should say, advanced video equipment. In 1984, everyone didn't have a video camera, but right. He advertised that he had video equipment and would do special filmings for people. Lake shows up with Charlie, and that family of three suddenly vanished. So that was probably the first murder in which Charles Ng was involved.
Now, I spoke at the beginning of the program about Leonard Lake and Charles Ng's fantasy of abducting women and keeping them as sex slaves in their dungeon, in their homemade dungeon. But you spoke of Leonard Lake's first victim being his own brother, and then his second victim most likely being his best man at his own wedding. Why were these people murdered in the end when the trial is finished and you've gathered all the information? Why is this part of Leonard Lake's master plan? Why does it fit in with the rest of his plan to abduct and kidnap and kill these people that are not women, but just happen to be people in his circle, people that he's connected with?
Those murders were for nothing more than the minor amount of money he could get by collecting their disability checks and cashing them. That's it, nothing more. Isn't that amazing? It's chilling to think that he was so rejecting of the value of life that he would kill his own brother and his best friend just so they could have their small checks.
Yes, his desire for his own needs, his own physical and his own needs and sexual fantasy just seemed to be paramount over anyone else was concerned. Now, who are the first women to be held in the cell, tortured and videotaped?
Probably a young woman named Kathy Allen. When Ng was in Leavenworth, he was in there with a fellow prisoner, another Marine named Mike Carroll. Mike and Kathy Allen were lovers in the South San Francisco area. Suddenly, one day, Kathy is working at Safeway, and she gets a call where she's working, and someone is saying that Mike needs her very badly over in Lake Tahoe. She is panicky, and she goes out to a car where a bald-bearded man is waiting for her, and that's Leonard Lake, under an assumed name. And he takes her to Wilseyville, and she is the first one that is filmed on the so-called M Ladies tape, the M standing for Miranda, and you recognize that name from the Fowles book, The Collector.
Right.
So he used that as a code name from then on to identify his plan to abduct women, M Ladies. And Kathy Allen is shown on that tape being stripped and abused.
Now, part of the torture is the psychological torture that Leonard Lake and Charles Ng enacted on their victim. Just give us a little. We don't want to get into too much graphic detail, but there was a baby involved in this crime, in this story of Kathy Allen and Mike Carroll. Can you tell us a little bit about the type of psychological torture that these two men enacted on their victim regarding this baby?
Well, just a slight correction there. The baby belonged to a couple who lived in a house up above the Wilseyville house, Brenda O'Connor and Lonnie Bond.
Okay, I'm sorry.
And they happened to be the next victims. And on that same M Ladies tape, we see a segment of Brenda O'Connor also being tortured. And she's asking, "Where's my baby?" And they're making these terrible comments about the baby's asleep forever, or the baby's been given away to a couple in Fresno. And she is just desperate. The poor woman is just begging, "Oh, please, you can't take my baby." and they're just taunting her terribly while they're also forcing her to strip and being abused. So the only two women who were actually videotaped in this whole series of murders were Kathy Allen and Brenda O'Connor.
Okay. Now, how many more victims do they fall under Leonard Lake and Charles Ng after Brenda O'Connor and Kathy Allen and Charles Gunner and Donald Lake? How many victims are we up at now after the videotapes of those two women? At that point, how many people have been murdered by this pair?
You know, Dan, no one knows for sure how many victims there were. There were bits of burned bones found on that property that represented anywhere from 15 to perhaps 25. Some people have even guessed up to 40 victims. Eventually, the trial involved charges for murdering 12. So after Kathy Allen and Brenda O'Connor and Brenda O'Connor's mate, Lonnie Bond, and that baby that we just mentioned, Lonnie Bond Jr., and there was another man named Scott Stapley from Southern California. So there were 12 murders in the eventual charges against Ng because Lake was no longer around by that time.
Okay, let's talk about that. What happened at a lumber yard that led to Leonard Lake's arrest, and what happened to Charles Ng that same day?
Leonard was still working on finishing up some of his bunker building, and he and Charlie Ng went to South San Francisco to a lumber yard and hardware store to buy some things. While Leonard is shopping around for the things he knows he needs, Charlie decides it'd be a good idea to steal a vise of all things, a 30-pound vise. He picks up, tries to conceal in his shirt, and walks out, but he's spotted, and the police are called. By the time they arrive, Charlie has put the vice in the trunk of a stolen car they're using from another victim, and Charlie makes a run for it. Leonard comes out to talk to the police and offers to pay, but no. They look in the car and they find some stolen weapons. They also find documents that suggest that Leonard Lake is not who he says he is. He identifies himself as Lonnie Bond, as we know now, one of the victims. They take Leonard to the police station, and he realizes he's in big trouble. Now, all through his whole life, Leonard has said he would never go to jail again after he was captured up at Philo and bailed out. He carried a cyanide capsule with him from then on.
Okay.
While he's in the South San Francisco lockup, he begins to confess, tells us that, yes, he's been involved in crimes, and he names Charles Ng as his accomplice, and he asks for a glass of water and a piece of paper to write a note. He writes a note to his family, pops the cyanide capsule out, probably in his collar of his shirt, drinks it, and collapses. He lasts 6 days after that in a hospital on life support and dies.
Now, what did police find when they searched Lake's bunker? And what was carved on a plaque on the wall of the cell when officers first discovered the room?
Well, as a result of the investigation about the car, they find it belongs to a man who's been missing for several days, Paul Cosner, who is one of the victims in the murder charges, and they realize that they've got something going on very important here. They send investigators and get the address. There was a piece of paper, a bill in the car that showed the address up in Wilseyville. So San Francisco Missing Persons police go up to look at the cabin, and they begin looking around more and more, and they realize they've found something really interesting here. They can't go in the bunker without a search warrant, right? So they contact Cricket, Claire Balaz, and she agrees to meet them up there, but she's not very cooperative. Matter of fact, she goes into the house and seizes a calendar and tears some pages out of it that may implicate her in this thing. Right. the police immediately get a search warrant, and they go into that bunker, and they find the secret door and the cell, and I don't think there's anything engraved on I don't remember any engraving, but they did find a typed piece of paper with rules on it. Would you like to know what those rules say?
Sure, certainly.
Sure. Hang on just a sec. I need to pick up some. Oh, here it is. Okay. These are the rules posted in the bunker for the women in there. 1, I must always be ready to service my master. I must be clean, brushed, and made up with my cell neat. 2, I must never speak unless spoken to, unless in bed. I must never look my master in the eye, but I must keep my eyes downcast. 3, I must never show my disrespect, either verbally or silent. I must never cross my arms or legs in front of my body, or clench my fists, and unless eating, must always keep my lips parted. 4, I must be obedient completely, and in all things I must obey immediately and without question or comment. 5, I must always be quiet when locked in my cell. 6, I must remember and obey any additional rules told to me. I must understand that any disobedience, any pain, trouble, or annoyance caused by me to my master will be grounds for punishment. Those were the rules.
Now, police found a series of underground buildings, or possibly more than one building. Can you describe a little bit about what the police discovered in this home, the construction that Leonard Lake had done?
Well, the bunker is separate from the house. The bunker is outside and is cut into the hillside. The police realized that the perimeter of the place does not match the tool room that they see as they open the front door of it. So when they go in, that's when they discover the secret door and the cell. And there's a tiny cell in there with a bunk bed in it and a bucket for the use of as a toilet and a roll of toilet paper and the rules, and that's it.
Now, as far as Leonard Lake's accomplice, Charles Ng, were police initially able to find him?
No, at the lumber yard, when Lake was arrested and took his cyanide later, Charlie ran for it. Cricket, who later was claiming she had nothing to do with any of this, picked him up and drove by the lumber yard and saw the police talking to Lake and realized that their big trouble is going. So she took him to a bus station, took Charlie to a bus station. He catches a bus to Chicago and crosses into Canada and is on the run for a while.
Now, you say he makes it to Canada, and in your book you say he makes it all the way to Calgary, and they speculate that he has some family members that might have assisted him, but nevertheless, he ends up getting caught in Calgary. Tell us what happened, and how did he finally get caught in Calgary?
He was actually, we believe he was probably staying with some relatives for a while, but at that time when he was caught, he was camped out in a big park, and he was in a department store and was spotted by the guard shoplifting some food, some canned items, some soft drinks, and slipping them into his backpack. They confront him, and the guard pulls a gun, and Charlie wrestles with him, and the guard is shot in the hand. And so now it becomes much more than a shoplifting case, so they arrest Charlie, eventually find out he's wanted in the U.S. On federal warrants, but they try him in Canada and sentence him to 4.5 years in a Canadian prison.
Now, you talk about him being sentenced to 4.5 years in a prison in Edmonton, in the same province as Calgary, yes, for the charges stemming from the lumberyard altercation and arrest. And now, he was placed in isolation, or we call protective custody, while in Edmonton, where he met a fellow inmate who was housed in the adjacent cell named Maurice Laberge. They struck up a friendship, conversing while outside for their hour exercise and writing notes to each other. What did Ng tell Laberge, if anything, regarding the murders?
He told him just about everything, and he illustrated them too. They were in cells side by side but there was enough space under the cell door that they could reach under and pass notes or books or pieces of paper back and forth. At LaBerge's request, he learned that Charlie was a pretty good artist, cartoonist, and Charlie began drawing on 8.5 by 11 paper cartoons. And so he not only told LaBerge about the murders they had committed and the things they did, but he drew cartoons, obscene, disgusting, vile, horrible, pornographic cartoons depicting what they did. One of them shows Charlie labeled it sometime in the future. He could see into the future, and it shows him in a jail cell, and on that jail cell are posted drawings of Kathy, O'Connor, and several of the other victims with just terrible things I can't even say on this program about what they were doing to them.
Now, this LaBerge had encouraged Charles Ng to draw or recognize his talent, and there was a series of cartoons, 150 in total, if I'm not incorrect, and he had told him details about the murder. Did LaBerge also write down the details of their conversations as well pertaining to the murders? And why was this Maurice LaBerge, even though he's convicted of heinous crimes, that's why he ends up adjacent to him in this isolation cell in Edmonton prison facing serious time, why would LaBerge encourage Charles Ng and then provide this information to authorities?
Well, he eventually began to see that he could use it as LaBerge could see that he could use that as a leverage to get himself a shorter sentence. And so he began talking to authorities. He also professed a disgust for what Ng was saying, that at first he thought he was just another guy, a cellmate, but he turned out to be such a monster that LaBerge felt conscience-stricken to tell what he knew about him. And it probably did help LaBerge a bit. He got out soon afterwards.
Now, how long was this correspondence between these two people?
Well, I think it was a good portion of the 4.5 years that Ng served in that prison.
Oh. Okay, now the Canadian justice officials refused to extradite Charles Ng because he would likely be sentenced to a death penalty once extradited back to the U.S. Now, can you tell us a little bit about, how the story resonated in the U.S. concerning this refusal to extradite a convicted and very, very serious, high-profile murderer?
Actually, for the whole 4.5 years that Charlie was in prison up there, there were negotiations going on between the two countries. The U.S. saying, we want this man back to pay the penalty to come to justice for those incredible crimes that were committed here in Calaveras County. Meanwhile, Canada is saying we do not send people back for the death penalty. I guess in Canada there is no death penalty, so they didn't want to comply with that. The United States representative said, yes, do you really want to become the place where all murderers go so they can avoid the death penalty? I think that carried some persuasion. I can't say what the final decision was based upon, but finally, in legal hearings, it was decided in Canada that they would indeed extradite Charles Ng back to the U.S. for trial.
Okay, now, you said finally Canada relented, and that was in 1991. He was sent back to California for trial. Now, Clara Lynn Ballas, Cricket, Leonard Lake's ex-wife, becomes a central figure in the trial. Can you explain that? Why did she become a central figure? What was her role in the trial? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Charles Ng was clearly involved in a lot of these murders, but there was no forensic evidence connecting him to them. There was the M lady's tape showing him abusing two girls, and there was a lot of there were remains found on the property, but nothing really connected Charles Ng forensically to these murders. The authorities thought that Clara Lynn Ballas would be able to cast some light on that, so eventually they made a deal with her. They offered a complete immunity for her testimony in the trial.
She gets complete enjoyed immunity, and how does she testify? She testifies against Charles Ng, but what does she have to say about Leonard Lake in the trial that can help convict Charles Ng as well? How is that connection between Charles Ng and Leonard Lake and Cricket help to convict Charles Ng at trial?
Actually, it didn't. Clara Lynn came to the trial in Orange County. It was moved from Calaveras County because there were so few people in that small county up in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada that it was decided he couldn't get a fair trial there. They would all automatically believe he was guilty. So it was moved to Orange County down here in Southern California. Clara Lynn was given immunity. She showed up, and I was sitting in the courthouse that day and watching, and they called her up to the stand. They said, "What is your name?" She said it. "Thank you, that's all, no more questions," and they excused her. It's inexplicable. I have no idea what they were thinking. I have no idea why they offered her immunity in the first place. She should have been tried, I believe, but they got nothing from her. The evidence presented against Charles Ng mostly was those cartoons and a lot of other circumstantial things that eventually led the jury to a verdict.
Now, you talked about that her deal for immunity, in your opinion, was wrong, and that she should have been charged. Definitely, she had something to do with these crimes, and very willing participant. Now, was there some outrage when the public found out about this deal? Was there anything resonating in the media from the public talking about? Was there anything to the story itself that people thought it was unfair that this person was receiving immunity despite her involvement in these crimes?
Well, we have to be very careful about this. I'm not saying that she is guilty of anything. She may or may not be. A lot of people suspected she did, and I suspected it, but we don't know that. We can only go by what was presented in trial and in the newspaper accounts. So we don't know whether Clara Lynn Balazs really was involved in murders or any actual crimes. But it turns out that she did nothing to actually help convict Charles Ng. And it was controversial, no doubt about it.
So there was outrage from the public concerning this?
Well, I don't know. The newspapers had to be very careful, too, in what they were saying. So I don't know how much the public knew about Clara Lynn Balazs. I tried tried to be cautious in my book about indicting her for anything that she may not be guilty of.
Certainly. Now, how high profile was this trial and this case, and how prominent was it as it appeared in the media at that time? How big a story was this?
Well, it's a huge story, and I have to admit my publisher was right and convinced me to do it, because this book is now in its 13th printing and has been a bestseller for nearly 10 years, and has resulted in my appearing on 4 television documentaries and a couple of live talk shows, and it has legs. People are interested in this thing because it's so mind-boggling, it's so staggering what these two people were convinced themselves was the right thing to do, to kill people for their own greedy, disgusting perversions. Now,
at the trial, it really struck me as probably being the most horrific, or one of the most horrific moments is the recalling of the actual video itself and the playing of the video at the trial, where you featured Kathy Allen and Brenda O'Connor on videotape. Now, how did the courtroom attendees, including the family, react to that videotape being played at the trial?
It was very, very sad. And believe me, they used that video over and over and over in the 9 months. I'll bet I saw it 50 times.
Wow.
They just, and that was so weighed heavily against Charles Ng, and many of the family members of those victims were at the trial. Kathy Allen's sister was there, and she was crying, and Robin Scott Stapley's mother and father, who had followed the trial. They'd gone to Canada and listened to hearings up there. They'd gone to the hearings in Calaveras County. They virtually exhausted their fortune to follow this all the way through. So did Paul Cosner, whose car was stolen, and that's the one that was found at the lumberyard. Paul Cosner sister, Sharon Solito, followed this trial all the way through from Canada to Calaveras County to Orange County. And they were so absolutely determined to see justice done. But I sat with these family members, and I got to know most of them pretty well. And I could just feel their pain. It is so sad. Cliff Peranto was a co-worker of Charles Ng that was one of the murder victims. And Cliff's half-brother was there, and he told me these long tales of what a good boy Cliff was. They had been, several of the siblings had been put out to foster homes, and some of them were pretty mistreated. And Cliff, being the oldest sibling, would escape from his to go tend to his siblings and help them out all he could. It was just heartbreaking to feel the pain that these people were going through all through that 9 months of trial.
Now, were cameras allowed at the trial itself?
There was no television coverage of it. Still cameras were allowed by news reporters, but no television.
No television. Okay, now I understand the trial ended up, and this was surprising, ended up being the most expensive trial in American history, even more than the O.J. Simpson trial. What made this case so expensive?
Well, two key reasons, Dan. One was the very length of it, 9 months. It's a long trial.
Right.
And two is Charles Ng. Here's a guy who, with a high school education and raised in Hong Kong, and we have a million or more people in prison in the United States, and there are many of them who regard themselves as jailhouse lawyers. But believe me, Charles Ng was a master. He learned the law, and it was said that he did it while he was in Leavenworth and in the Canadian prison. He spent just as much time, and he had a lot of time on his hands studying law. And he learned that you could. There were so many ways to set up appeals. He learned that if you fire your lawyers, it's called a Marsden motion here in California, and he learned how to use that. And he fired lawyers. He had 6 judges replaced over the period of time, and he had his defense attorneys of 3 or 4 sets of them changed. He was just an absolute master of manipulating our system here. And each time he would successfully lodge one of these appeals or objections, it would take time and expense. So he was a very costly fellow to convict here in California.
Now, you talked about him delaying the trial and studying law so that he would be more prepared. Now, given that, how effective was he and his defense at the trial? And maybe you can tell us a little bit about the missing bullets and the eyewitness testimony that was not able to be used at the trial, and what that effect was. What was that effect in the terms of the trial at Charles Ng?
Well, I'm a little puzzled by the missing bullets. I'm not sure that there were no forensic evidence at all that tied him to any bullets or smoking gun or fingerprints or anything else. His attorneys tried to just say that Lake was the mastermind in this, and Charlie was nothing but a gullible bystander who just went along with it, but did not participate in the murders. That was the defense his lawyers used. But they made a terrible blunder, in my opinion, late in the trial. Charlie testified in the trial, and that's unusual too. The great majority of time, murder defendants do not testify because it subjects them to cross-examination, which can get them in a lot of trouble. But Charlie testified, and while he was testifying, the assistant defense attorney brought up the cartoons. The prosecution hadn't brought them up. And the judge even told this attorney, said, "Why are you bringing these up?" Well, because I want to bring it up myself before the prosecution does. But the prosecution hasn't done it. And he asked, the attorney asked Ng, "Did you say that?" And he would say all these profane things that were spelled out on these cartoon papers that Charlie drew. And did you do this? Did you say this? Did you do that? And it made it so explicitly clear that he had done those things and said those things. And the prosecution didn't bring it up, but the defense did. And I feel that had a great deal of weight in convicting him.
Now, you talk about the artwork at the trial and them examining it. What was it about the artwork? Was the artwork, did it match forensic evidence, and is that why the artwork was very important?
No, but it matched names and events. It spelled out Kathy and showed a picture of Lake, a drawing, I should say, of Lake and Ing abusing her, and then identified her by name. And it did that with quite a few of the other victims too. So it was very clear that Charlie was present when the abuse and the torture was going on, and obviously the killing too. Then, and so that connected him to it in the minds of the jurors, I'm sure. And there were 150 of those cartoons, so it's not some minor matter. 150 pornographic cartoons depicting torture and murder.
Now, what I talked about the bullets, and I don't want to labor this point, but what it was is that there was an eyewitness, the victim's roommate, that could not positively identify Charles Ing, and then he was wounded, and those bullets ended up lost by the police force in San Francisco, I believe.
Oh, okay. I know what you're talking about. A man named Donald Gioletti, who was a disc jockey in San Francisco, and he was gay, and he put an ad in for that he would give certain services to, and Leonard Lake showed up at his place and took advantage of those services, and then shot Gioletti. But that really didn't involve Charlie Ing. Charlie Ing was not charged with that particular murder. As a matter of fact, no one was ever charged with that murder.
I see. Sorry for the confusion. Now, what did the jury finally decide for Charles Ing?
Well, he was charged with 12 murders. 12 murders, and they found him guilty of 11 of them. And sadly, the one for Paul Cosner, and that was one I mentioned, that his sister followed all the way through it, and she was partially responsible, or was, I should say, largely responsible for the investigation being launched in the first place. Because when her brother went missing in San Francisco, she was extremely persistent in demanding the police stay after it, and she would not relax and let them just shove it aside. And she just pushed and pushed and pushed, and was instrumental in keeping the investigation going. It was his Honda that was stolen, and his Honda that was in the lumber yard that Ing deposited the device in the trunk of when Lake was arrested. So, but the evidence seemed to indicate that Lake and Ing went for a test ride in that car, which was for sale. Paul Cosner put it up for sale. They went to test ride it, and then Paul disappears, and they have the car. And Charlie was obviously very involved in that one. But for some reason, the jury just did not see convincing evidence that Ing had participated in the killing of Paul Cosner. So they had a hung jury on that particular count. But they got 11 other convictions on him.
What was he finally eventually sentenced to? What was his sentence?
He's sentenced to die in the gas chamber. We had a gas chamber at that time, but Charlie's still up there. This happened in 1998. This trial began, and Charlie is one of 700 convicts on death row in California. We have executed 13 since it was reinstituted in this state in 1973. We're getting way behind. We're not ever going to catch up. And Charlie, by the way, in this state, a death penalty is automatically reviewed by the Supreme Court, automatically appealed to the California Supreme Court. Charlie's hasn't even gone that far yet in the over 10 years since he's been convicted.
Now, talking about the death penalty, and given the extraordinary delays to the death penalty and the exorbitant cost for these numerous appeals, what is your opinion regarding the death penalty, and did this case in any way change your mind at all about the death penalty?
Dan, I'm glad you asked. I've been sitting here thinking about writing a letter to the local newspapers about the death penalty. Here we are in this state. Our governor is trying to find desperate measures to cut back. We have like more than a $20 billion deficit in this state. trying to find ways like selling a fairgrounds here in Orange County. And yet, we continue to pretend that we have a death penalty. And in this state, when a defendant is found guilty of murder, then we have a penalty phase, which is very expensive, tacked on the end of it. And then we have the automatic appeals. And then we have appeals beyond that. And then we have retrials when the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals overturns these death penalty cases, which they do with great regularity. We are spending billions of dollars in this state pretending that we have a death penalty when we're not ever going to catch up. As I say, 700 people on death row, and it just ain't going to happen. And now we're considering building a new death row at great expense because this one's getting overcrowded. These guys sit up there on death row, and it's no great pleasure. It's not a country club hotel, but they do have computers in there and single cells where many other prisons there are 3 or 4 or 5 men to a cell. Death row inmates have a single cell all to themselves, and it's just outrageous. To me, I'm a proponent of the death penalty, but not the way it's administered in this state. We need to get rid of it.
I see. Now, how did writing this book affect you? Given all the books that you've written, how did this book affect you?
You know, I think true crime writers tend to be like homicide detectives. We pretty soon we develop kind of a thick skin and just look at it as something to our job that we do. But I can't help but be emotionally impacted by this. And let me tell you this: there were 12 jurors whom I befriended. I was really a lucky guy. At the end of the trial, you never even talk. You don't even say hi to a juror during a trial. But afterwards, then I approached 1 or 2 of them out in front of the courthouse and asked if they would be considered an interview. And I guess my approach worked because I got a call the next day, and all 12 of them were willing to give me an exclusive interview. And I became friends with them. I went to their reunions for a while. Now, how it affected me is one thing. How it affected them is another. Several of them had to go through post-traumatic stress syndrome treatment after spending 9 months watching the horrors of that trial.
Certainly. Yeah, it's an incredible story and an incredible impact on everyone. I want to thank you very much, Don, for a very informative program, and thank you for agreeing to come on the program at all. And I just wanted to tell people, if you have a website, do you have a website at all, website address?
You know, I've never developed a website, but they could reach me on my email address, which is easily found anytime, and I'd be glad to respond to any of that. I get letters in the U.S. mail and on my email quite frequently, and I love to respond to my readers. So thanks for that offer, and thank you so much for allowing me to be on your program. I've enjoyed it.
Well, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it, and have a good night.
Thank you, Dan. Good night.
Thank you, Don. You've just listened to Don Lasseter, and he's the author of Die For Me, the terrifying true story of the Charles Ng Leonard Lake Torture Murders. That's on Pinnacle Books. It's by Don Lasseter, Lasseter. You've been listening to the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. I will talk to you next time. At the end.
That's correct. He probably would be a harm to others.
Okay, now Charles Ng is the other killer featured in Die For Me. What was his background, and what type of character was Charles Ng?
Charles Ng was born in Hong Kong to a middle-class family. His father had survived the war and worked his way up to become a camera salesman for a major company, had 3 children, and determined absolutely that his kids were going to have a great education. They lived in a high-rise apartment, very crowded, with several relatives living with them. But Charles didn't seem to go along with the idea that education was that important. So his father sometimes had to give him a pretty good spanking. He was later accused of beating him severely. But it didn't seem to change the young man. Eventually, they sent young Charles Ng to England to live with a relative. That didn't work out. And then by the time he was in high school age, they sent him to San Francisco to live with an aunt. He did that for a while, but as soon as he turned 18, he joined the Marines. It's interesting how he got in the Marines because he's not a U.S. citizen. Somehow it was suggested that documents were forged to allow him to get in there.
Okay, I see. Now, how did Charles Ng and Leonard Lake eventually meet? You say they were both in the Marines. How did they meet and where?
Well, Charlie decided while he was in Kaneohe Bay in Hawaii that it would be a good idea to steal some weapons from the armory and sell them for profit. He did, and he was caught, and he was facing a court-martial, but he escaped and made his way to San Francisco. While he was in Hawaii, dissolved them in acid. That sort of gave a hint of what kind of a peculiar man he was going to be.
Yes, certainly. Now, continuing with his peculiar behavior, maybe you could just continue with his background and also leading up to his stint in the Marines.
Correct. He went through high school and then soon after high school, joined the Marines and went to Vietnam. There's some controversies whether he actually saw combat or not. He claimed he did. Later, I think he confessed to one woman that he spent most of the time in a very safe place. But he came back all disillusioned, as many real Vietnam veterans did, and decided he wanted to be a survivalist, preparing for a future Holocaust in which the world would be destroyed. And he decided he would have a bunker equipped with all kinds of supplies so he could survive, and he would like to have a woman in there too. Eventually, he decided that that woman would be his sex slave. And that became a fantasy for him, stemming from his having read The Collector when he was a teenager. But he perverted it somewhat. Fowles' character, protagonist, just wanted the woman to fall in love. Leonard admitted that he wanted the woman just to be a sex object.
Now, when we talk about the Leonard Lake doing a stint in Vietnam and Marines, he was discharged for medical reasons, like I had mentioned. What was that medical reason?
Let's see, I think it was called impending psychosis or something of that nature. He apparently had some very serious mental problems.
Didn't the psychiatrist say that he was a harm to himself or to others? Was that the conclusion they made?
To be a change of venue from Northern California to Orange County, where I live. So that was pretty convenient. I agreed. I went over and sat in the trial for a couple of days and was hooked. Obviously, this was going to be a very, very important true crime story.
Now, a British author named John Fowles had written a popular fictional book called The Collector in 1963. It ends up being quite significant to the story. Before we get to the significance, what is the book about, and from whose perspective is the story primarily told?
The Collector by John Fowles is about a young man, Frederick Clegg, who is a butterfly collector, and he falls for a very pretty young woman named Miranda. But he realizes that he's just not in her class, and he just has a lot of fantasies about her. Clegg comes into a good sudden fortune, and which allows him to buy a house out in the country, and he gets this brilliant idea to just capture Miranda like he does his butterflies and hold her there until she falls in love with him. The first third of the book is told from his point of view. The second third is from her point of view. And then finally, the last part is his point of view again. He holds her. She does not fall in love with him. He does not have sexual fantasies about her, unlike what we see in the Charles Ng Leonard Lake case.
Well, let me cut you off right there so we can unfold this story here, because it is a very complex story as well. So we've got to get everybody to get the facts straight here. Now, in the book The Collector, the imprisoned woman, Miranda, tries many ways to either escape or persuade her abductor to let her go. Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zapazzi, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history and the authors that have written about them. Today's program is with author Don Lasseter and his book, Die For Me, the terrifying true story of the Charles Ng Leonard Lake Torture Murders. Inspired by a fictional book called The Collector, ex-Marines Leonard Lake and Charles Ng abducted, tortured, and murdered women in a secret homemade dungeon, all the while videotaping their ghastly deeds. They took the lives of at least 16 victims and are among the most notorious serial killer teams in true crime history. Die For Me, the terrifying true story of the Charles Ng Leonard Lake Torture Murders by Don Lasseter. My guest, Don Lasseter, is now working on his 19th and 20th books. One was about World War II, one about the Kennedy assassination, and one called The Patricia Cornwell Companion. All the rest have been true crime. His first book was published in 1995. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, Don Lasseter.
Thank you for inviting me, Dan. I've been looking forward to talking about Charles Ng.
Yes, very much. This is quite the story, an incredible story. Now, the first question I have to ask you, you've written about many other cases. What specifically made you decide to write about this one?
As a general rule, Dan, I prefer not to deal with high-profile cases like this one. I'd much rather select a small, relatively unknown case which has some interesting twist in its plot, and it doesn't have high publicity. But in this case, my publisher gave me a buzz and asked me if I would drop over to the trial, which happened.
Does the collector ever mention that he might let the woman go?
I think in the book he hints at it sometimes, but I think he has no intention to let her go ever. Eventually, she comes to know that she's not in real danger, but she unfortunately dies anyway while under his control, perhaps from pneumonia. We don't know.
Okay, now Leonard Lake is one of the killers featured in Die For Me. And what was Leonard Lake like? What was his background? And finally, he was discharged from the Marine Corps because of medical reasons. And in the end, can you tell us what that medical reason was? So give us the background on Leonard Lake. What was he really like, and what was some of his background?
Well, Leonard Lake was born, to an ex-Navy man and a young woman in San Francisco. The parents soon split up when the woman decided to try to pursue her husband, ex-husband. She went to a train station with her 2 babies. She had asked Leonard, who was only 6 at the time, if he'd like to go with her, and he'd said no. But at the train station, he decided he wanted to go and just had a big fit right there on the platform. But he had to stay home with his grandparents. Psychiatrists later suggested that was the beginning of Leonard Lake's hatred for women. He grew up and he never lived with his parents again, lived with his grandparents, grew up in San Francisco, went to high school, had some peculiar characteristics. One of his cousins later reported that Leonard had a huge collection of mice, and when he got tired of them, he gave some away and killed the rest of them, and the cousin watched Leonard